The letter from Emmett Vance described a schoolteacher position in the flourishing mining community of Cutters Creek, Colorado Territory. It mentioned a proper schoolhouse, an established student body, and a salary paid reliably on the first of each month. It did not mention that the flourishing mining community was a collection of 43 men, 11 women, and a rotating cast of mules. The proper schoolhouse was a converted storage shed that still smelled powerfully of kerosene and old rope. The established student body was 14 children ranging in age from 5 to 16. 3 of whom did not speak English, and the salary had not been paid reliably since the previous teacher left in March under circumstances no one in town seemed willing to explain. The letter from Josephine Alcott described an experienced educator with a firm command of mathematics, literature, and classical languages. It mentioned 5 years of teaching experience. It did not mention that 4 of those years had been spent tutoring her younger brother in their mother's parlor in Cincinnati. That her command of classical languages consisted of being able to identify Latin when she saw it, and that she had accepted this position primarily because she had run out of other options. They were both optimists. That is a polite way of saying they were both liars. They were perfect for each other. They just didn't know it yet. I have been collecting stories from the old Colorado Territory for going on 30 years now. And I want to tell you about Emmett Vance and Josephine Alcott, because their story is the kind that stays with you long after you've set it down. Not because it is dramatic, though parts of it are. Not because it ends the way you expect, though it does not. But because it is honest about what it costs to build a life with someone you did not choose under circumstances you did not plan for, and what it means when that cost turns out to be the best investment either of you ever made. Emmett Vance was 41 years old. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same rock he spent his days pulling silver from. He had come to Colorado from western Kentucky at the age of 26, following a vein of ore and a bad decision about a woman in that order. He had been in Cutters Creek for 11 years. He had helped build the school shed with those hands. He was the one who had written the letter to the Cincinnati teaching agency. Because the town's 14 children had been without formal schooling for 4 months, and 2 of the miners' wives had told him directly that if something was not done about it, they were taking their families to Pueblo, and Emmett Vance was not prepared to let Cutters Creek become the kind of place people left. He was not a complicated man. He believed in hard work, fair dealing, and not saying more than you needed to. He had been briefly married in his early 30s to a woman named Sarah who had died of fever in the winter of 1874, and in the years since he had become so accustomed to his own company that he had stopped noticing the silence. He did not want a schoolteacher, he needed one. There is a difference, and Emmett understood it clearly. What he was not prepared for was Josephine. She arrived on the Denver and Rio Grande on a Tuesday in late September, which in the San Juan Mountains means the aspens had already turned and the first hints of serious cold were coming down off the peaks in the early mornings. Emmett was at the depot in Durango to meet her because Cutters Creek did not have its own depot, a fact he had also failed to mention in the letter. She stepped off the train carrying a leather satchel, a crate of books wrapped in oilcloth, and an expression that he would later describe to his friend Horace as the look of a woman who has just realized the stagecoach goes somewhere. She has not agreed to go. Emmett's first thought was that she was younger than he expected. His second thought was that she was looking at the mountains like they had personally offended her. His third thought was that the crate of books was going to be a problem on the wagon road. He introduced himself. She shook his hand with a grip that surprised him and said, "Mr. Vance, I have a number of questions about the specifics of the position that were somewhat vague in your correspondence." He said, "I expect you do." She said, "How many students?" He said, 14. She said, "Ages?" He said, 5 to 16. She paused. "That is quite a range." He said, "Yes." She looked at the mountains again. She looked at the wagon. She looked at the crate of books. She said, "Is there a road?" He said, "There's a road." She said, "Is it a good road?" He said, "It's a road." On the 3-hour wagon ride to Cutters Creek, she asked about the schoolhouse. He described it accurately. He had learned at some cost that describing things inaccurately created problems that were worse than the thing itself. She was quiet for a long time after he described the schoolhouse. Then she said, "Your letter said established student body." He said, 14 children is established." She said, "Your letter said proper schoolhouse." He said, "It has walls and a roof." She said, "A roof." He said, "A good roof. I put it on myself in July." She looked at him with an expression he could not fully read. Then she looked back at the road which had begun climbing in earnest, and did not say anything else for the better part of an hour. What Emmett did not know, and would not know for several weeks, was that Josephine Alcott's silence on that wagon ride was not the silence of disappointment. It was the silence of a woman doing rapid arithmetic. Josephine Alcott had come to Colorado because she was 34 years old, and her options had narrowed to a point she found uncomfortable to look at directly. She was the second daughter of a Cincinnati clockmaker who had died when she was 22, leaving her mother, her younger brother Edmund, and an older sister who had married a pharmacist and considered the matter of her family's welfare largely settled. For 12 years Josephine had been the practical one. She had kept the household accounts. She had tutored Edmund through his schooling and into a clerkship. She had taught herself to stretch a modest income across immodest needs, and had done it without complaint because complaining was not something she had time for. She had not married. This was not because no one had asked. One man had asked when she was 27. A steady and decent man who worked for the railroad. She had declined because she had not wanted to trade one set of responsibilities for another, without some say in the shape of her own life. By 34 she was beginning to wonder if she had miscalculated. Her brother was settled. Her mother had moved in with her sister. The house they had lived in was sold. Josephine had $26, a crate of books, and a letter from a Colorado mining town that used the words flourishing and established in a way that turned out to be more aspirational than descriptive. She had expected a real school. She had expected students who were, at minimum, within 5 years of each other's age. She had expected a town that looked like a town. What she was doing on that wagon road, while Emmett Vance sat beside her in silence, was this. She was deciding not to be afraid of what she had gotten into. Because Josephine Alcott had spent 12 years solving problems that other people considered unsolvable, and a converted kerosene shed in the San Juan Mountains was just another problem with a solution she had not found yet. She would find it. She always did. The schoolhouse was exactly as described. That is to say, it was exactly not what she had expected. The smell of kerosene had faded to a background note but was still present. The desks were mismatched, borrowed from the mining company's surplus and from people's homes. There were 3 slates and a half box of chalk. There was no globe, no primer set, no reader above the 3rd level. One wall had a crack along the bottom wide enough to slip 2 fingers through. She walked through it alone the first morning before the children arrived taking inventory. When she was done, she sat on one of the mismatched chairs and wrote a list of everything that was missing. It was a long list. Then she wrote a second list. Everything that was there. 14 children, 3 slates, half a box of chalk, her crate of books which she had brought herself and which contained, among other things, 2 readers, a McGuffey's primer, a dog-eared copy of Plutarch's Lives, and a mathematics text she had used to teach Edmund. 1 good roof which Emmett had put on in July, 4 walls, one with a crack, a wood stove that appeared to be in working order. It was not nothing. She had started with less. The children arrived at 8 in the morning. The 5-year-old twins belonging to a miner named Horace Finch came holding hands and refused to release each other for the first 3 days, which Josephine decided to treat as a feature rather than a problem, and seated them together. A boy named August, who was 16, and had arms like a young ox, sat in the back row and stared at the ceiling with the expression of a person doing time. 3 children, 2 brothers and a girl who appeared to be their cousin, spoke primarily Czech, the language their parents had brought from Bohemia, and Josephine greeted them each morning in the 12 words of Czech she had learned from a neighbor in Cincinnati and watched the tension go out of their shoulders every single time. She could not teach them all the same thing at the same time. She understood this immediately, so she did not try. She divided them by what they could already do, not by age, and reorganized the room so that the oldest were paired with the youngest in a way that made both feel useful. August, who could do multiplication in his head faster than she could write it on the slate, became her assistant for mathematics whether he wanted to or not. He did not want to. By the end of the 2nd week he was showing the Finch twins how to count on their fingers with the focused patience of someone who had discovered, to his own surprise, that he was good at something. Josephine told him so. She said it plainly, without flourish, the way she said most things. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he said, "Nobody told me that before." Then they weren't paying attention. Emmett heard about this from Horace Finch on a Friday evening at the assay office, and he did not know what to do with the feeling it gave him, so he put it aside the way he put aside most feelings and went back to the work of keeping the mine producing. He saw Josephine at the evening meal, which the town took communally in the largest of the 3 buildings that qualified as permanent structures. He was not a man who had much to say at meals. She, he was discovering, was a woman who had rather a lot to say, but said it precisely. No words wasted, every observation pointed. She was not making conversation. She was collecting information, and she collected it by asking questions that were so direct that the men at the table initially did not know how to respond to them. She asked the Czech brother's father what his sons could read in their own language. She asked Horace Finch what he wanted his twins to know by the time they were 12. She asked a miner named Calhoun what he regretted not learning as a boy. Calhoun said, after thinking about it longer than anyone expected, that he regretted not understanding contracts before he signed them. She said, "I can teach that," he said. To children, she said, the principles of it. How to read what a document actually says versus what someone tells you it says. Yes, I can teach that. Emmett watched this from the end of the table and thought for the first time in a long time that he might have done something right. The problem came in October. Problems in the Colorado Territory in October were usually about weather, and this one was no exception. Though it arrived sideways from a direction Emmett had not anticipated. The crack in the schoolhouse wall had been widening since August's frosts. He had not told Josephine because he had intended to repair it, and had not found the time. When the first early snow came down hard off the mountain on the 3rd of October, the crack admitted enough cold air that 3 of the younger children went home with chills, and their mothers came to find Emmett directly. He went to the schoolhouse that afternoon to assess the damage. Josephine was still inside, sitting at her desk by lamplight, marking exercises on a piece of paper she had cut into smaller pieces because she was rationing paper. She looked up when he came in. He said, "I should have fixed the wall sooner." She looked at the crack. She looked at him. She said, "Yes, you should have." He said, "I'll get to it this weekend." She said, "The children went home cold today." He said, "I know." She said, "I need that wall fixed before Monday." He said, "I said weekend." She said, "I heard you, I'm confirming." He looked at her. She was not angry in the way he was accustomed to women being angry, which was to say she was not performing it. She was simply stating the terms. He found this, against all expectation, easier to deal with than any alternative. He said, "It'll be done Saturday." She said, "Good." Then she looked back at her work. Then she looked up again and said, "While you're at it, the door doesn't hang right. It lets cold in at the bottom." He said, "I see that." She said, "And the stovepipe needs cleaning. I can smell it backing up when the wind comes from the north." He said, "Is that all?" She said, "For now." He fixed the wall on Saturday. He rehung the door. He cleaned the stovepipe. He found while he was at it that a section of the flooring near the east wall had soft spots where water had gotten under it, so he replaced that too. He worked from early morning until the light gave out, alone with the steady methodical focus that had served him through 11 years of hard country. When he was done, he stood in the empty schoolhouse and looked at what he had fixed. It was not a good schoolhouse, but it was a tighter one. On Monday morning, Josephine came in early as she always did. She walked through the room the same way she had the first day. Deliberately taking account, she tested the door. She ran her hand along the repaired wall. She noted the new flooring without comment. She said, "You fixed the floor too." He was outside chopping wood for the stove. He said, "Found some soft spots." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Mr. Vance." He said, "Emmett." She said, "Thank you, Emmett." He went back to chopping wood. He did not say she was welcome because it did not seem to expect it. They were both people who expressed gratitude in the same language as everything else, directly, without decoration, and then moved on. This was, though neither of them had found the words for it yet, the first thing they genuinely had in common. The moment that changed everything happened on a night in late November, that I want to describe to you carefully, because it is the kind of moment that is easy to misread if you are looking for the wrong things. The San Juan Mountains in late November are not gentle. The snow comes in sideways off the peaks and the temperature drops so fast in the evenings that the mules won't stand outside after dark. On the 22nd of November, a boy named Edmund, not Josephine's brother, but a miner's son of 9 years old who had been named, by coincidence, the same, fell down an old shaft that had been improperly covered on the east side of the claim and broke his leg badly. The bone had not come through the skin, which was good, but the angle was wrong in a way that everyone present could see clearly and that no one knew what to do about. Cutter's Creek did not have a doctor. The nearest physician was in Durango, 3 hours away on a clear day. The weather was not a clear day. It was the kind of night where you could feel the cold pressing through the walls, and the windows were already frosting on the inside. There were 7 adults in the building with the boy, his parents, Horace Finch, 2 other miners, Emmett and Josephine, who had been at the communal meal when the alarm was raised and had come without being asked. Nobody had asked her to come. It had not occurred to anyone that she would be useful. She was the schoolteacher. She was also the person in the room who had spent 2 years helping her mother nurse her father through the last illness of his life, who had read every medical text she could get her hands on during those 2 years, because she did not know how to sit still in the face of a problem she didn't understand, and who had at the age of 23 set her younger brother's dislocated shoulder in their kitchen while waiting 3 hours for a physician who arrived too late to matter. She did not announce any of this. She looked at the boy's leg. She looked at Emmett and said, "I need 2 straight boards about this long." She held her hands apart. "And the cleanest cloth in this building and someone to hold him still who won't flinch." The room went quiet. Emmett said, "You've done this before?" She said, "Similar?" "Yes." He said, "What do you need me to do?" She told him. He did it without asking for further explanation, which was exactly what she needed because there was no time for explanation. He held the boy's shoulders with those mining hands, steady and solid, and talked to him in a low, even voice about the creek where he used to fish in Kentucky and what the water looked like in early spring, while Josephine worked with the boards and the cloth and what she knew. She was not certain she was doing it right. She would admit this later, to Emmett and to no one else. But she knew that doing nothing was certain to be wrong, and she knew enough to try. The boys' parents were in the corner holding each other. Horace Finch was at the door, unable to watch but unable to leave. The other miners had stepped outside. It took 40 minutes. When it was done, the leg was splinted and bound, and the boy was sweating with the pain of it, but had stopped making the sound that had filled the room when they first brought him in. Josephine sat back on her heels and pressed her palms flat against her thighs to stop them from shaking. Emmett was still beside her. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. He said, "Where did you learn to do that?" She said, "My father was sick for a long time. I learned what I could." He said, "You were ready for this," she said. "I was ready because I didn't know what I was going to face. I never do. I just try to make sure I've learned enough to be useful when it matters." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That's the most practical philosophy I've ever heard." She looked at him. It was not something she had expected him to say. She said, "Your letter said flourishing mining community." He said, "Your letter said 5 years teaching experience." She said, "4 of those years were in a parlor." He said, "Most of my flourishing is theoretical." She looked at him for another moment. The lamp on the table between them made the shadows go long across the floor. Outside, the wind was doing what the San Juan wind does in November, which is to say it was making it clear who is in charge. She said, "I wouldn't change my letter." He said, "You lied in yours." He said, "You lied in yours." She said, "I know." He said, "I know." And there, in a converted supply building on the backside of nowhere, with a splinted child sleeping between them and a blizzard pressing against every wall, something shifted between Emmett Vance and Josephine Alcott that neither of them had the vocabulary for yet, but that both of them recognized. Not love in the way they had read about it, if they had read about it. Something quieter and more durable than that. The recognition that the person beside you is the same kind of person as you. Not in circumstances, not in background, not in anything so simple, but in the ways that matter when things go wrong. The boy was taken to Durango in a wagon when the weather broke 3 days later. He healed. He walked without a limp by spring, which was not guaranteed, and which Josephine held as a fact she did not discuss publicly but thought about on hard mornings. The winter that followed was the hardest Cutter's Creek had seen in a decade. The snows came early and stayed late. The road to Durango was impassable for 6 weeks in January and February. Emmett kept the mine producing by a combination of engineering improvisation and the particular stubbornness of a man who has decided that something will not defeat him. Josephine kept the school running through 3 separate weeks when she had no chalk at all. Using charcoal sticks she made herself from wood she pulled from the stove's ash box when she was sure she had found pieces that burned clean. She taught the older children to make them. August by February was producing a charcoal stick of a quality that Josephine told him was better than what you could buy in Cincinnati. He said, "You're saying that to make me feel good." She said, "I am not in the habit of saying things I don't mean." He looked at her with the expression of someone who is recalculating an assumption they have held for a long time. He said, "My pa says women always say what they think you want to hear." She said, "Some do. I find it waste time." He said, "My pa also says you're the best teacher the creek has ever had." She said, "How many teachers has the creek had?" He said, 3. She said, "What happened to the other 2? He paused. He said, "First one left after a month, second one." He paused again. "There was an incident." She said, "With the students?" He said, "With Mr. Vance." She turned to look across the room at Emmett, who was on one knee repairing the stovepipe bracket with the careful focus he brought to everything mechanical. He appeared to feel her looking at him. He did not turn around, but the back of his neck, she noticed, had gone a shade darker than the rest of him. She decided to ask him about the previous teachers at a later time, in private. She filed it as information to collect. She was coming to understand how she and Emmett Vance communicated most effectively, not at meals or in public but in the practical spaces between tasks, when neither of them was performing anything for anyone. She asked him that evening, walking back from the communal meal through the first real cold of the night. He told her. The second teacher had tried to close the school 2 weeks after arriving, had declared the situation impossible, and had written to the school board in Denver, which did not exist, asking to be relieved. Emmett had told him, with a precision and finality that had apparently been memorable, that the situation was not impossible, and that he would be grateful if the teacher kept his opinions about what was and wasn't achievable to himself, until he had spent more than 14 days trying. The teacher had left the following morning. Josephine listened to this. Then she said, "Did you tell him the school was impossible or that he was?" Emmett was quiet for a moment. He said, "I may not have been specific enough." She said, "The situation is not impossible." He said, "No, it's not." She said, "It's also not flourishing." He said, "Not yet." She stopped walking. He stopped a half step after her, turned to look at her. The sky above the mountains was the black that is specific to high altitude, thick with stars in the way that still startled her sometimes, a year after she had first seen it. She said, "Not yet." He said, "That's what I said." She said, "I know, I was agreeing with you." He looked at her for a moment in the dark. He was not a man who had much practice receiving agreement, and it showed. She said, "You're allowed to be surprised that I agree with you occasionally, but you don't have to look quite so alarmed." Something happened at the corner of his mouth that she had not seen before, not quite a smile, the precursor to a smile in a man who had apparently not used the equipment in some time. He said, "You are not what I expected." She said, "No, I don't imagine I am." He said, "I'm not what you expected either." She said, "You are exactly what you seemed. That is unusual and I mean it as a compliment." He thought about that. He said, "Your letter said classical languages." She said, "I can identify Latin." He said, "Can you read it?" She said, "Some of it, if it goes slowly." He said, "My letter said established community." She said, "You have 43 men and a very functional assay office." He said, "And a school." She said, "And a school." The stars over Cutter's Creek were doing what stars at altitude do, which is to say they were being unreasonably beautiful, the kind of beautiful that feels like it is commenting on the smallness of everything underneath it. Josephine had stopped finding this cruel after the first 2 months. She had started finding it simply true. Emmett said, "I think the school is going to be all right." She said, "The school is going to be fine, it's the road that's the problem." He said, "I'm working on the road." She said, "I know you are." They stood there a moment longer, both of them looking up, because there was nothing else to do with that kind of sky. Then he said, "You stayed." She said, "I said I would." He said, "The other teachers said that too." She said, "I am not the other teachers." He looked at her. He said, "No, you're not." They were married in the spring in the same shed that had spent the winter as a schoolhouse, because it was the largest covered space in Cutter's Creek, and because Josephine said that if she was going to get married in a mining camp, she was at least going to do it in the building she had made functional. Emmett said that was reasonable. He was learning that Josephine's definitions of reasonable were broader than most people's, and usually correct. She wore a dress she had ordered from the catalog and altered herself because it had arrived 3 inches too long in the hem and the sleeves. Emmett wore his good shirt, which was the same shirt he owned. Horace Finch's wife played the fiddle. August, who had turned 17 by then and had opinions about everything, served as witness and cried briefly and denied it afterward to anyone who brought it up. The Czech brothers brought wildflowers down from the slopes above the tree line. Nobody had asked them to. They appeared at the door with their arms full of them and the particular fierce dignity of children who have decided to do something lovely and are not going to be talked out of it. Josephine looked at the flowers for a moment. Then she looked at Emmett. He was watching the brothers with an expression she had learned over the winter to read. The look of a man who is moved by something and is trying to be quiet about it. She did not say anything. She took one of the flowers and put it in his buttonhole and let him be quiet about it. Over the next 20 years the school grew. Not because the town grew dramatically. Cutter's Creek remained a modest operation, as mining camps go, and the silver played out eventually the way silver always does. But because the reputation of the school grew, and parents from the surrounding areas started sending their children down the road that Emmett had in fact improved, which took 3 years and a persistent campaign of persuasion directed at the county, in which Josephine wrote the letters and Emmett delivered them personally and refused to leave until someone in authority acknowledged they had been received. The schoolhouse was properly rebuilt in 1887. It had 4 rooms by 1895. August Brennan, who had learned mathematics from Josephine in a kerosene-smelling shed on a mismatched chair, became a mining engineer in Denver and came back every year at Christmas time. He always brought chalk. Josephine taught for 31 years in Cutter's Creek. She taught the children of the miners and then she taught the miners' grandchildren. She taught reading, arithmetic, Latin when she had finally gotten around to learning it properly, which took her until her 40s, and on the last Friday of each month, in the older grades, the principles of contract law, because Calhoun had been right and she never forgot a good idea. Emmett built her a proper classroom for her 40th birthday. He built it himself as he had built most things, and it was crooked in one corner and the windows were not quite level. It was the most useful thing she had ever been given, and she said so, and he knew she meant it the same way she always meant everything. Entirely, without decoration, and as a fact. He ran the mine until 1901, and then he ran it less because his knees had started telling him things he didn't want to hear about the future. He spent more evenings reading by then. He had started with the almanacs and the mine reports and the Denver papers. He ended, some years in, with Josephine's books, which had grown from the original crate to fill 2 shelves and a windowsill, and a stack beside the bed that she maintained was organized in a system he simply did not understand. He read Plutarch's Lives. He read Shakespeare. He read, because Josephine suggested it, and then declined to help him with the harder passages, because she said he would learn more from the difficulty. A volume of Cicero that she had ordered from a bookshop in Denver. He read it slowly. It took him 2 winters. He told Horace Finch one spring afternoon that he had ordered a schoolteacher and received a library. Horace said, "Is that a complaint?" Emmett said, "It's the best trade I ever made." Emmett Vance died in 1914 at the age of 73, in the proper house he had built, with the windows that were not quite level, on a morning in April when the aspens were starting to come back. Josephine lived until 1928. She taught her last class at the age of 67, and spent the remaining years reading and writing letters to her former students, and sitting on the porch in the evenings watching the mountains do what mountains do, which is to stand there being entirely themselves without apology. She read to herself aloud sometimes in the evenings. Her neighbors, who could hear her through the open window in summer, reported that she read a great many things, but returned most often to Cicero. Nobody asked her why Cicero. She probably would have told them if they had. She was not a woman who withheld information unnecessarily. My guess is it had something to do with a man who read it slowly over 2 winters, because she told him he would learn more from the difficulty. She came expecting a proper schoolhouse. He came expecting someone who already had the answers. They were both wrong, and what they built instead, out of charcoal sticks and rehung doors, and a boy's broken leg in a blizzard, and the particular patience of 2 people who had each decided, separately and then together, to stop being afraid of what they had gotten into, was stronger and stranger and more honest than anything either of them had planned. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer. Josephine walked into that shed knowing she had overstated her experience and stayed anyway. Emmett sent a letter full of optimistic geography and then spent a winter making it true. Who do you think had the harder job? And if you've ever walked into a situation you weren't ready for and decided to learn it instead of leave it, tell me about it down below, because those are the stories worth keeping.